My uncle once told me something that haunts me to this day. The human mind can normalize anything, he said, stirring his coffee with a trembling hand. Give it enough time, and even the worst torture becomes routine. I never understood what he meant until I became part of something I should have run from the moment they offered it to me. It started in 2017. I was working as a marine biologist for Meridian Oceanic Research, a company with laboratories scattered across the Pacific. The pay was decent, but the isolation was brutal. Our facility sat on a manufactured island 60 miles from the nearest landmass, accessible only by helicopter or supply boat. Most of us lived in the dormitory complex, a sterile collection of white buildings connected by glass walkways. I thought I'd found my calling studying deep-sea organisms that thrived in impossible conditions. Creatures that lived without sunlight, feeding on chemical reactions around volcanic vents. Life that had adapted to environments that should have been lethal. That fascination would prove to be my downfall. The accident happened during a routine dive. We were collecting samples from a newly discovered thermal vent system at 3,000 feet. The submersible's pressure hull developed a microfracture that went undetected until we were already at depth. The implosion was instantaneous. I remember the water rushing in, the crushing weight of the ocean trying to compress my body into nothing. The cold was so intense it felt like fire. My lungs collapsed, my eardrums ruptured, and consciousness fled as the Pacific tried to claim me. The rescue team found me 40 minutes later, floating unconscious in my emergency suit. By all rights, I should have been dead. The pressure alone should have liquefied my organs. Instead, I was in some kind of suspended state, alive but barely registering vital signs. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the facility's chief medical officer, was waiting when they brought me up. She had this look in her eyes, like she was seeing a miracle and a catastrophe at the same time. "Marcus," she said as I drifted in and out of consciousness in the medical bay. "You shouldn't be breathing right now." My brother Jake flew in from Seattle when they told him about the accident. He found me hooked up to machines, my body a map of injuries that should have been fatal. Crushed ribs, collapsed lungs, massive internal bleeding. Yet somehow I was stable. "The pressure differential should have killed you instantly," Dr. Vasquez explained to both of us. "We don't understand how you survived." That's when they made the offer. Meridian had been developing something called the Adaptive Cellular Protocol, a treatment that could help the human body survive in extreme environments. It was still experimental, tested only on lab cultures and a few volunteer subjects under controlled conditions. But given my unique survival, they thought I might be an ideal candidate. "It's revolutionary," Dr. Vasquez said, her voice carrying the enthusiasm of someone who'd spent years on a breakthrough. "Nanobiological enhancement that allows cellular structures to adapt in real time to environmental pressures. The applications for deep-sea research, space exploration, extreme environment survival, it's limitless." Jake was skeptical, but I was desperate. The pressure injuries were slowly killing me. My organs were shutting down one by one. Without intervention, I had maybe weeks to live. "What exactly does it do?" I asked through the oxygen mask. "It learns," she said simply. "The protocol observes stress patterns in your cellular structure and develops adaptive responses. If you're exposed to crushing pressure, it strengthens your tissues. Extreme cold, it regulates thermal generation. It's like having your body's survival instincts enhanced 1,000-fold. The treatment itself was surprisingly simple. A single injection of what looked like liquid mercury, but moved with an almost organic fluidity. It was warm going in, and I could feel it spreading through my bloodstream like a gentle current. Within hours, my vital signs stabilized. The internal bleeding stopped. My collapsed lung reinflated. By the third day, I was sitting up, feeling better than I had in months. "How do you feel?" Dr. Vasquez asked during one of my checkups. "Normal," I said. "Maybe better than normal." But normal was a relative term that I was about to lose entirely. The first incident happened 2 weeks after treatment. I was back in the lab examining specimens from the thermal vents. These were organisms that lived in water hot enough to melt steel, yet they thrived in conditions that would instantly kill any other life form. I was holding a sample container when it slipped from my hands. Instinctively, I reached into the thermal preservation unit to catch it, a unit that maintains samples at temperatures exceeding 400 degrees Fahrenheit. My hand plunged into water that should have cooked the flesh from my bones. Instead, I felt a strange tingling sensation as my skin seemed to shimmer with an oily, reflective coating. The scalding water felt warm, like a pleasant bath. I held the sample container for nearly 30 seconds before the reality of what was happening hit me. When I pulled my hand out, it was perfectly unharmed. The silvery coating faded back into my normal skin tone, leaving no trace of what had just occurred. Dr. Vasquez was ecstatic when I reported the incident. "The protocol is working exactly as designed," she said, making notes on her tablet. "Your cells detected extreme thermal stress and adapted an appropriate defense mechanism. This is incredible, Marcus. You might be the first successful human trial." But success, I was learning, was a matter of perspective. The adaptations started small. I found I could hold my breath for over 20 minutes without discomfort. My vision adjusted automatically to different light levels, allowing me to see clearly in near-complete darkness. I could function normally in water pressure that would crush an ordinary person. At first, it felt like gaining superpowers. I could dive deeper, stay underwater longer, and survive in conditions that would kill my colleagues. The research applications were extraordinary. I was collecting data from environments that had been previously inaccessible. But the protocol wasn't just responding to my environment, it was responding to my thoughts. The realization came during a particularly stressful period. I'd been having nightmares about the submersible accident, reliving that moment of crushing pressure and drowning. During one of these episodes, I woke up gasping, convinced I was still trapped under 3,000 feet of water. My skin had taken on that reflective, metallic quality again. My lung capacity had increased dramatically, and my blood chemistry had shifted to process oxygen more efficiently. The protocol had adapted me for deep-sea survival while I slept, responding to the stress patterns in my dreams. "This is concerning," Jake said when I told him about it during one of our video calls. He'd returned to Seattle but was keeping close tabs on my condition. "You're changing based on your fears? It's more complex than that," I tried to explain, though I wasn't sure I understood it myself. "The protocol seems to interpret any form of stress, physical, psychological, even imagined, as a threat to adapt against." This became problematic very quickly. I started obsessing about the deep ocean, unable to stop thinking about the crushing darkness and impossible pressures. The more I thought about it, the more the protocol adapted me for that environment. My bone density increased. My blood chemistry shifted. My skin took on an almost translucent quality, and my eyes enlarged to capture more light. But the worst part was the psychological adaptation. The protocol wasn't just changing my body, it was changing my mind to match my new capabilities. I found myself craving the deep water, feeling restless and confined when I stayed on the surface. The bright lights of the facility began to hurt my adapted eyes. I preferred the cool, dark spaces of the lower levels. "We need to slow this down," Dr. Vasquez said during one of my increasingly frequent examinations. "The rate of adaptation is exceeding our projections." But it was too late for caution. The protocol had momentum now, and my obsessive thoughts were feeding it like fuel to a fire. I began spending my off hours in the facility's pressure chamber, subjecting myself to conditions that simulated deep ocean environments. Each session triggered new adaptations. My skin became more resilient, developing a texture that could regulate temperature and pressure. My internal organs restructured themselves for efficiency in low-oxygen environments. The breaking point came when I realized I could no longer survive comfortably in normal atmospheric conditions. I woke up one morning gasping in the thin air of my dormitory room. My adapted physiology now required the dense, pressure-rich environment of the deep ocean. Being on the surface felt like suffocation. "This has gone too far," Jake said when he flew back to the facility. "You need to stop the treatment." But there was no stopping it. The protocol had become self-sustaining, continuing to adapt my body based on environmental pressures I was no longer consciously controlling. I was caught in a feedback loop of my own making. The facility's medical team tried everything they could think of. Drugs to suppress the adaptation process. Psychological therapy to control my obsessive thoughts. Even surgical intervention to remove the nanobiological components. Nothing worked. The protocol had integrated too deeply into my cellular structure. I was no longer Marcus, the marine biologist. I was becoming something else entirely. The final transformation happened when I could no longer resist the call of the deep water. I suited up for what I told everyone would be a routine dive. But I knew it would be anything but routine. The submersible carried me down past the thermal vents, past the deepest trenches we'd ever explored, into crushing darkness that should have been lethal. Instead, it felt like coming home. At 8,000 feet, I opened the hatch and stepped out into the impossible pressure of the deep ocean. The protocol had adapted me so completely that I could breathe the water, process the crushing pressure, and see clearly in the absolute darkness. But the psychological cost was devastating. I spent what felt like hours, though time has little meaning in the abyss, exploring this alien landscape. The thermal vents glowed like distant stars, and strange creatures drifted through the darkness like living nightmares. I felt a kinship with them, these organisms that had adapted to survive in conditions that would destroy any surface-dwelling life. I had become one of them. The rescue team found me 3 days later, floating motionless near a cluster of thermal vents. To them, I appeared to be in some kind of catatonic state, though I was fully conscious and aware. I simply had no desire to return to the surface world that my body could no longer tolerate. Dr. Vasquez's voice crackled through the communication system as they brought me up in a specialized pressure suit. "Marcus, can you hear me? We're bringing you home." But home was a concept that no longer applied to me. The surface world felt alien and hostile. The bright lights burned my adapted eyes. The thin air left me gasping. I could only find comfort in the facility's pressure chambers, maintaining the deep ocean conditions my body now required. The psychological evaluations that followed were difficult. "You've adapted beyond our ability to reverse the process," Dr. Vasquez admitted during one of our sessions. "The protocol has rewritten your basic physiology, but we might be able to help you adapt to surface conditions again, given time." Time was something I had in abundance, but patience was not. Every moment spent in the surface world felt like torture. I found myself planning ways to return to the deep ocean, to the crushing darkness where I belonged. That's when they made the decision to terminate the protocol. The weeks that followed my discovery in the abyss were a blur of medical examinations, psychological evaluations, and increasingly desperate attempts to understand what I had become. The facility's medical team ran every test they could think of, trying to map the extent of my transformation. "Your cellular structure has been completely rewritten," Dr. Vasquez explained, showing me brain scans and blood work results that looked like they belonged to an entirely different species. "The protocol has integrated so deeply that we can't distinguish between your original biology and the enhanced components." Jake stayed at the facility, sleeping in the visitors' quarters and spending every possible moment trying to reach whatever remained of his brother. But I was slipping away from him, becoming something that belonged more to the deep ocean than to the surface world. "Do you remember Mom's birthday last year?" he asked during one of his visits to my pressure chamber. "You called me from the boat, complaining about the weather." I tried to focus on the memory, but it felt distant and unimportant. Surface concerns seemed trivial when compared to the vast mysteries of the deep ocean. Why should I care about birthdays and weather when there were thermal vents to explore and abyssal creatures to commune with? The psychological changes were perhaps more disturbing than the physical ones. My priorities had shifted completely. I found human conversation tedious and shallow. The concerns of surface dwellers, their jobs, relationships, fears about mundane things, struck me as pointless distractions from the real wonders of existence. Dr. Vasquez brought in specialists from around the world. Marine biologists, neurologists, experts in extreme environment adaptation. They studied me like a specimen, which was appropriate since that's essentially what I had become. "The neural pathways have been restructured," one neurologist explained to the assembled team, His brain is processing sensory information differently. He's literally seeing and hearing the world through adapted sensory organs. They were right. Colors appeared differently to my modified eyes. I could detect pressure variations and chemical compositions in the air that were invisible to normal human perception. Sometimes I could sense the emotional states of the people around me through subtle changes in their bioelectric fields. But the most significant change was in my relationship to fear and pain. The original trauma of the submersible accident had been completely recontextualized by my transformation. What had once been a terrifying near-death experience now felt like an awakening, a necessary step toward becoming what I was meant to be. The crushing pressure that should have killed me had instead liberated me from the limitations of human biology. This shift in perspective worried the medical team more than any of the physical changes. "He's developing a form of traumatic dissociation," the staff psychologist reported. But instead of retreating from the trauma, he's embracing it as a positive transformation. It's unlike anything in the literature. They tried various therapeutic approaches. Cognitive behavioral therapy to help me reconnect with my human identity. Medication to suppress the adaptive responses. Even experimental treatments designed to slow down the protocol's integration. Nothing worked. If anything, the attempts to reverse my condition only made me more aware of how much I had changed and how impossible it would be to return to my former existence. The breaking point came when they tried to keep me confined to the facility. "For your own safety," Dr. Vasquez explained when I expressed my desire to return to the deep ocean. "We don't know what extended exposure to abyssal conditions might do to you, but I knew extended exposure would complete my transformation, allow me to become fully adapted to the environment where I belonged. The facility's artificial pressure chambers were a poor substitute for the real thing, so I waited for my opportunity. It came during a routine equipment transfer. A submersible was being prepared for a supply run to one of the deep-sea research stations. I had clearance to access the submarine bay as part of my ongoing rehabilitation program. I suited up in one of the deep-dive rigs, telling the technicians I was conducting a systems check for Dr. Vasquez. By the time they realized what was happening, I was already descending toward the thermal vents. This time, I went deeper than ever before, past the established research zones, into regions of the ocean that had never been explored. The protocol responded to the increasing pressure by accelerating my adaptation process. At 12,000 feet, I encountered something that changed everything. They were waiting for me in the deepest trenches, creatures that existed at the absolute limits of what life could endure. But these weren't the primitive organisms I had studied in the lab. These beings showed signs of intelligence, of organized behavior that suggested a complex society hidden in the abyss. They communicated through bioelectric pulses and chemical signals that my adapted nervous system could interpret. What I learned from them shattered my understanding of life on Earth. They had been watching our surface world for millennia, these deep ocean dwellers. They had seen the rise and fall of countless species, the slow evolution of life from the primordial oceans to the complex ecosystems of the modern world. And they had been waiting for someone like me, a bridge between their realm and ours. The protocol, I realized, hadn't been developed entirely by Meridian Oceanic Research. It was based on biological samples recovered from the deepest ocean trenches, samples that contained genetic material from these ancient beings. The nanobiological components weren't just adapting me to survive in extreme conditions. They were preparing me to serve as an ambassador between two entirely different forms of consciousness. The revelation was both terrifying and exhilarating. I was no longer Marcus, the marine biologist. I was becoming something unprecedented in human history, a hybrid being capable of existing in both the surface world and the crushing depths of the abyss. But the transformation came with a price that I was only beginning to understand. The deep ocean beings communicated concepts that human language couldn't adequately express. They existed in a state of collective consciousness, sharing thoughts and experiences across vast distances through the planet's magnetic field. Individual identity, as humans understood it, was a foreign concept to them. As my adaptation progressed, I found myself becoming part of this collective awareness. My thoughts began to merge with theirs, my individual consciousness dissolving into something larger and more complex. The person I had been was disappearing, replaced by a fragment of an ancient intelligence that had been waiting eons for this moment. Jake's voice, calling to me through the submersible's communication system, became increasingly distant and meaningless. The surface world and all its concerns faded into irrelevance as I experienced the vast, patient consciousness of the deep. Time moved differently in the abyss. What felt like hours of communion with the deep ocean beings translated to days of panic on the surface. Search and rescue teams scoured the ocean looking for my submersible, while I floated in the crushing darkness, undergoing the final stages of my transformation. When they finally found me, I was no longer entirely human. The extraction process was the most complex medical procedure ever attempted at the facility. They had developed a way to deactivate the nanobiological components, but it required essentially resetting my cellular structure. It would leave me vulnerable to all the injuries that the protocol had been suppressing, the original pressure damage from the submersible accident. "You'll likely die," Dr. Vasquez warned me during one of her visits to my pressure chamber. "But if we don't remove it, you'll be trapped in this adapted state indefinitely. And based on our observations, you're losing more of your human consciousness every day." She was right. Each passing hour brought new changes, new adaptations that pulled me further away from human baseline. The collective consciousness of the deep ocean beings was patient and welcoming, but it was also alien in ways that defied description. I chose to take the risk of extraction, not because I wanted to return to my human existence, but because some small part of me recognized that I was losing something essential, the capacity to bridge two different forms of consciousness. If I became fully absorbed into the collective, I would lose the ability to serve as a translator between worlds. The extraction felt like dying and being reborn simultaneously. Every adaptation the protocol had made began to unravel. My enhanced vision faded, leaving me nearly blind in the facility's normal lighting. My pressure tolerance disappeared, making even the artificial pressure chamber feel oppressive. The crushing weight of my original injuries returned with devastating force. Most devastating of all was the loss of connection to the collective consciousness. The vast, patient intelligence that had welcomed me into its embrace was suddenly gone, leaving me isolated in the fragmented awareness of individual human consciousness. I flatlined twice during the procedure. Each time, they managed to bring me back, but something essential was lost in the process. When I finally stabilized, I was Marcus again, but a diminished version of myself, no longer fully human, but no longer adapted for the deep ocean either. The months of recovery that followed were the hardest of my life. I had to relearn how to exist in normal atmospheric conditions. My memories of the deep ocean felt like dreams of paradise lost. Sometimes I would wake up convinced I was still down there, floating in the crushing darkness among creatures that understood what I had become. Jake stayed with me through the worst of it. He never asked about the things I mumbled in my sleep, fragments of communication from the deep ocean collective that still echoed in my damaged consciousness. He didn't question why I sometimes stared at bodies of water with desperate longing, or how I flinched away from bright lights as if they caused physical pain. The nightmares were the worst part of recovery, not nightmares of the accident or the transformation, but dreams of the collective consciousness I had lost. I would find myself back in the crushing depths, surrounded by ancient intelligences that welcomed me home, only to wake up gasping in the thin, inadequate air of the surface world. Dr. Vasquez tried to help me process the psychological trauma, but how do you explain to someone that you're mourning the loss of a form of consciousness they couldn't even imagine? How do you describe the loneliness of individual awareness after experiencing the warmth of collective thought? The extraction was successful, she told me during one of our sessions. All traces of the nanobiological components have been removed from your system. You're as close to your original baseline as we can achieve. But baseline felt like a prison. My unenhanced senses seemed dulled and inadequate. The world appeared flat and colorless compared to the rich sensory experience I had grown accustomed to. Worst of all was the silence, the absence of the bioelectric communications that had connected me to something vast and ancient. The facility's administration was eager to close the case. The adaptive cellular protocol was classified as a catastrophic failure, too dangerous for further human trials. The research data was sealed, and everyone involved was required to sign comprehensive non-disclosure agreements. "This never happened," was the unofficial message. "Marcus had a diving accident and made a remarkable recovery. End of story." Eventually, I was cleared to return to work, though not in marine biology. Meridian transferred me to their atmospheric research division in Colorado, about as far from the ocean as they could manage. The mountains were beautiful in their own way, but they felt like exile from everything that mattered. The first few months in Colorado were a constant struggle. Every aspect of normal human existence felt alien and pointless. Why should I care about atmospheric pressure variations when I had once communed with intelligences that had witnessed the birth of complex life on Earth? How could I find meaning in studying weather patterns when I had experienced consciousness on a planetary scale? I adapted to my new life because that's what humans do, we adapt. But it was a different kind of adaptation than what the protocol had offered. This was the slow, grinding process of forcing myself to care about things that felt insignificant compared to what I had lost. Sarah entered my life about a year after the move to Colorado. She was a fellow researcher, studying high-altitude atmospheric conditions and their effects on human physiology. She had kind eyes and a way of asking questions that didn't feel like interrogation. "You have the look of someone who's seen something extraordinary," she said during our first coffee together. "Good or bad? I can't tell, but definitely extraordinary." I deflected with humor, as I had learned to do with everyone who tried to get too close. But Sarah was persistent in a gentle way that gradually wore down my defenses. She never pushed for details about my past, but she made it clear that she was willing to listen if I ever wanted to share. The relationship developed slowly, carefully. I was terrified of forming deep connections with people who could never understand what I had experienced. But Sarah had her own scars. A childhood spent moving between foster homes, a sense of never quite belonging anywhere. We bonded over our shared experience of displacement, even though the sources of our alienation were vastly different. 2 years into our relationship, something unexpected happened. I was working late in the lab, analyzing atmospheric data from a high-altitude weather station, when I felt a familiar tingling sensation in my bloodstream. The nanobiological components were supposed to be completely gone, extracted and destroyed during the medical procedure. But as I stared at the data patterns on my computer screen, complex waveforms that reminded me of the bioelectric communications I had once shared with the Deep Ocean Collective, I could feel something stirring in my modified cells. The sensation was subtle at first, just a warm metallic feeling that I tried to dismiss as imagination. But over the following weeks, it became impossible to ignore. When I ran my fingers under hot water, I could see a faint, oily shimmer on my skin. My vision seemed sharper in low-light conditions. Most unsettling of all, I began to sense things that normal human perception couldn't detect. The collective consciousness was calling to me. It came in waves of sensation that bypassed normal sensory channels, communicating directly with whatever remained of my enhanced nervous system. The deep ocean beings were still out there, still waiting. And somehow, despite the extraction procedure, part of me remained connected to their vast intelligence. I tried to hide the returning symptoms from Sarah, from my colleagues, from the medical team that continued to monitor my condition. But the changes were accelerating, becoming harder to conceal. "You've been having nightmares again," Sarah observed one morning over breakfast. "And you're doing that thing where you stare at water like you're listening to something." I made excuses, blamed stress from work, suggested I might need to adjust my medication. But Sarah wasn't fooled. She had the instincts of someone who had learned to read people for survival. "Marcus," she said, taking my hand across the kitchen table, "whatever happened to you before we met, whatever you're still carrying from that time, you don't have to face it alone." The kindness in her voice almost broke me. How could I explain that I was mourning the loss of something that most people would consider a horror? How could I make her understand that the isolation of individual human consciousness felt like a kind of death after experiencing the collective awareness of the deep? But her acceptance gave me the courage to try. I told her everything: the accident, the protocol, the transformation, the collective consciousness of the deep ocean beings. I expected her to think I was suffering from some kind of psychotic break, that the trauma had damaged my ability to distinguish between reality and delusion. Instead, she listened with the focused attention of a scientist encountering a new phenomenon. "Show me," she said when I finished the story. So I did. I demonstrated the faint shimmer that appeared on my skin under certain conditions. I showed her how my vision adapted to different light levels. Most convincingly, I shared some of the complex mathematical relationships that the collective consciousness had communicated to me, formulas that described atmospheric and oceanic interactions with a precision that wouldn't be achieved by human science for decades. Sarah ran the calculations through her own research models. The results were undeniable. I had access to information that shouldn't have been possible for someone with my background and training. "This is real," she said, staring at the data on her computer screen. "Whatever happened to you, whatever you're still connected to, it's real." The validation was both liberating and terrifying. If the connection was real, then the collective consciousness was still out there, still waiting for me to complete the transformation I had begun. The question was whether I had the courage to answer their call. Years passed in this strange liminal state. I built a life with Sarah in the mountains, working with atmospheric pressure systems and trying to pretend I was satisfied with ordinary human existence. We got engaged, bought a house, talked about starting a family. But the ocean called to me still. Sometimes I would drive to the coast just to stand at the water's edge, feeling the pull of something vast and patient in the depths. The waves sounded like voices speaking in a language I had once understood fluently. The salt air carried scents that triggered memories of the abyss, of floating weightless in crushing darkness among intelligences that had welcomed me as family. The collective consciousness was evolving, I realized. The connection between the surface world and the deep was growing stronger as climate change altered ocean currents and temperature gradients. The ancient beings were preparing for something, a convergence that would require ambassadors who could exist in both realms. I wasn't the only one. Through subtle bioelectric signals that my enhanced nervous system could detect, I began to sense others like me scattered around the world. People who had undergone similar transformations, who carried fragments of the collective consciousness in their modified cells. We were being prepared for something unprecedented in human history. The realization came during a particularly vivid dream. I found myself back in the crushing depths, surrounded by the collective consciousness that had once embraced me. But this time I wasn't alone. Other hybrid beings floated in the darkness beside me. Men and women from different parts of the world who had undergone their own versions of the transformation. We were meant to be translators, I understood. Bridges between two entirely different forms of consciousness as the surface world and the deep ocean began to interact in ways that would reshape the future of life on Earth. When I woke up, Sarah was watching me with concerned eyes. "You were speaking again," she said, "but not in any language I recognized." I looked at my hands and saw the metallic shimmer spreading across my skin like morning dew. The protocol wasn't gone. It had been dormant, waiting for the right moment to resume the transformation that had been interrupted years before. "I have to go back," I told her, though the words felt like tearing something essential from my chest. "The ocean is calling, and I don't think I can resist much longer." Sarah was quiet for a long time, processing what I had told her. Finally, she spoke. "Then I'm coming with you." The absurdity of the suggestion should have made me laugh, but I could see the determination in her eyes. She had spent her career studying extreme environments and their effects on human physiology. The idea of witnessing the next stage of human evolution wasn't terrifying to her. It was the opportunity of a lifetime. "You don't understand what you're asking," I tried to explain. "This isn't a research expedition. If I go back to the deep ocean, I might not come back as the same person. I might not come back at all. But you might come back as something more," she said. "Something that could help humanity understand what's happening to our planet, what's coming next in our evolution." Her words carried an echo of the collective consciousness, a recognition that the boundaries between surface and depth, between individual and collective awareness, were beginning to dissolve. Maybe she was right. Maybe the transformation I had undergone wasn't a tragedy to be mourned, but the first step towards something unprecedented and necessary. As I sat there in our bedroom in the Colorado mountains, feeling the protocol stirring in my bloodstream, and hearing the distant call of ancient intelligences from the deep ocean, I realized that my story was far from over. It was just beginning. Much like my uncle, I don't believe we can truly escape what we've adapted to become. The question isn't whether we can resist change, but whether we can guide it towards something beautiful rather than something destructive. And sometimes, when it rains in the mountains and the water runs toward distant seas, I dream of diving deep enough to find the answers that wait in the crushing darkness where life first learned to evolve. The collective consciousness is patient. It has waited millions of years for consciousness to develop the complexity necessary for true communication between realms. It can wait a little longer for me to find the courage to complete what I started. But not much longer.